Let's go ahead and get things started. I wanted to say good morning and thanks for joining us for MNCASA's Action Week. My name is Kenosha Davenport. I am MNCASA's board chair, and I'm also the executive director for the Sexual Violence Center. Webster's dictionary defines a coalition as an alliance of distinct parties working together to achieve a common goal. As you saw last year, our collective action led to changes in how sexual assault kits are stored and tracked. And so for that, we would like to thank you. We cannot thank you enough for your support and hard work in this movement. I am especially elated to see that many of you have returned to work alongside MNCASA as we continue advocating for change. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, Kenosha. I'm Lindsay Brice. I'm the Law and Policy Director for the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and I'll be doing a bit of moderating of today's panel. And I'd like to just start with everybody doing a quick introduction. So we know who all is here. So for each of the panelists, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about the work your organization does, and if or why you focus on policymakers to advocate for victim survivors. And I don't know, Kenosha, do you want to add to what you've already said in the introduction? So anything you'd like to add?
Nope, I'm Kenosha, and it's great to see everyone and great that you are here. So thank you.
Thank you. And I guess I'm gonna call on people because otherwise it feels weird to figure out who goes next. So how about Artika?
Thanks, Lindsay. Good afternoon. It's great to be on such a esteemed panel of experts today, and want to thank the MNCASA team as well. So I'm Artika Roller, the Executive Director of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We are an organization that started as a grassroots organization in 1978 and was incorporated in 1982. And so we provide technical assistance, public education, public policy, media awareness, and prevention. MNCASA, we support, convene, and collaborate programs that are working towards ending sexual assault and providing support to victims and survivors. We also partner with prosecutors and law enforcement and our legislators to increase our effectiveness and really center victims and survivors in the work that we do. Some of our key components to our programming is we support our partner programs, medical personnel, law enforcement, legal and social service providers to deliver and educate folks on sexual assault and sexual violence prevention. We also, our prevention work support by developing capacity of our partner programs to design and implement effective community-based level prevention programming and work and strategies. We do policy reform through our public policy and education and advocacy work, and Lindsay is the director of that program for us. And then our system change work through our SBJI by developing capacity in our medical, community, criminal justice, social service, and judicial systems to incorporate coordinated response to the needs of victims and survivors. The last part of that question is, why do you focus on state elected officials to advocate for victims and survivors? And we've been having a conversation a lot, probably like many of you, to talk about what does this new world look like as we try to really dig into what public safety looks like for community and also for victims and survivors. I've been having this conversation with Nigel on our team, and he kind of frames it as the small P and the big P. And small P is kind of practice and the community level work. The big P is working with our policymakers to make system change. And the work that I've done, a lot of our work, community level work, depends on relationships and partnerships that we have with folks and people that are in those current positions. If those people leave or move, and we see that happen often, especially with law enforcement, that might be the end of that practice. That might be the end of that policy. So it's important that we get written policies and big state kind of comprehensive things involved. So I think it's our job. It's part of a holistic approach in doing our work to making sure that we're educating our legislators and they're advocating and also leading this work. We can't do the work alone. We need everybody that's impacted to work. Um, I would say the last thought I had about this is that in partnership with legislators, it is our job to keep and make sure that victims and survivors' voices are heard, listened to, and centered in the creation and revisions of all laws, policies, and allocations of funding. I will pass it back to Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Artika. Next, we have Bobbi from MAC.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Bobbi Holtberg. I am the Executive Director at the Minnesota Alliance on Crime, otherwise known as MAC. MAC has been an organization and a coalition that has been around since 1993. We are the General Crime Coalition in the state of Minnesota, and we have just around 97, 98 member programs throughout Minnesota. 2/3 of our programs are victim witness programs that reside within county and city prosecutorial offices. And the other third are community-based programs, statewide organizations that provide direct services to victims of crime. We provide a lot of technical assistance, training, networking opportunities, and then also engage in public policy reform and advocacy. I would say that our public policy focus is really twofold. The first is to work to center the voices of the most marginalized among us. And the other is to strengthen victims' rights and resources. So that's really the context within, we engage our elected officials and work jointly with our sister coalitions to achieve those things.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Katie from Violence Free Minnesota.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks to MNCASA for inviting us to participate on this panel. My name is Katie Kramer. I'm the Policy Director at Violence Free Minnesota, the Coalition to End Relationship Abuse. We are a statewide coalition of over 90 member programs that provide domestic and sexual violence services in all of Minnesota's 87 counties. So we have many overlapping members with the other coalitions here today. We represent victims and survivors of relationship abuse and our member programs. We challenge systems and institutions and work to promote social change. And we support, educate, and connect our member programs. And we do this with several values in mind. We are survivor informed. We work to raise the voices of marginalized communities. We work to institutionalize equity through policy work. We work to educate every new generation to be violence free. And we represent member programs and advance their interests. So since our inception in 1978, we have served primarily as a policy-based coalition. So other statewide DV coalitions sometimes focus on things like training. We are certainly a policy-heavy coalition. And much of that policy work, but certainly not all of it, has been focused on securing state and federal dollars for programs and who are providing services to domestic and sexual violence survivors and their families. And we really see policy work as our responsibility as a coalition due to all the incredible work that our member programs are doing on the ground and may not have the capacity to do policy work. We certainly feel like that is our responsibility as a coalition and in partnership with the other coalitions that are here today. The state has a relatively heavy investment in victim services, and that's really been attained through decades of advocacy and policy work for funding at the state and federal levels. So we have we see ourselves as having an obligation to see that funding at least be maintained, and at best, and what we're working for is to have that funding increased. And I know that we'll be talking about that today throughout the panel. So again, in order to accomplish this, we have to be engaged with policymakers on the state and federal level and communicate the important work that local programs are doing and the impact that that work is having on survivors, their children, and in local communities. So grateful to be doing that in partnership with all of you.
Thanks, Katie. It's great. I love hearing from all the coalitions and programs and hearing what everybody is doing. Next, we have Linda.
Hi, my name is Linda Thompson, and I am a member of the Boys Fort Ojibwe. And currently, I am the Operations Director at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. The Minnesota Indian Sexual Assault Coalition is a statewide tribal coalition and national tribal technical assistance provider. MUSAC, otherwise that's our acronym, has worked since 2001 to end gender-based violence and enhance tribal, state, and federal responses to sexual violence and sex trafficking. Currently, we have 39 member programs throughout Minnesota and 113 individual members. MUSAC uses culturally based training, technical assistance, strategies, resources, tools, and a wide range of events and activities to engage and support survivors of sexual violence, advocates, service providers, community, and allies that are working to end sexual violence and sex trafficking across Minnesota's 11 federally recognized tribal nations, as well as the urban native bases and tribal communities across the nation. MUSAC's work is grounded in the philosophy that each of us has a role, a purpose, and a place in eradicating sexual violence as we galvanize across gender, race, age, orientation, expertise, and experience. We are safer, all of us. We provide education and training with the 40-hour Native-specific sexual assault advocacy program. We have an annual conference. We do peer training. We have working with Elevate and Uplift National Technical Assistance, Tribal Sexual Assault Services Program. In the public awareness, we host and coordinate and collaborate with many partners to have the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples March, which just happened a week ago, our last weekend. We did a virtual event that lasted 4 days, starting with a sacred fire on day 1. We have the Solidarity Shawl Project, also the Barrett Project, a living memorial, Survivors Powwow. We have radio PSAs, Sexual Assault Awareness Month Learning Series, and then an LGBTQ Two-Spirit educational brochure, as well as Nicole's participation on the MMIW task force. Our vision is to create safety and justice through the teaching of our grandmothers. And thank you for asking us to be a part of today's events.
Thank you so much for being here. Comfort.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you on behalf of my community. Thank you so much for having us on this platform. My name is Comfort Dondo, and I am the founding executive director of Phumulani, Minnesota African Women Against Violence. We are, I think, one of the youngest organizations on this platform. We were founded actually by myself in 2017. Phumulani was birthed out of my own painful experiences with being a survivor of domestic abuse and trying to navigate through the systems and being unable to find culturally specific resources while I went through this process. So at Phumulani, our main mission is on ending all forms of gender-based violence for African-born women living in Minnesota in culturally specific ways that honor them. Our programming started with what we call healing circles, because we never had any kind of programming that was happening in the African immigrant community. And so we started doing healing circles 2 years ago with the support of the Bush Foundation. And we started realizing how prevalent domestic violence as well as sexual violence was in our community. So one of the main parts of our program is providing healing circles, which are culturally specific spaces where African immigrant women can meet and form community to start their healing journey on any kind of gender-based violence that they might have experienced. Our other programming includes referrals for African women, so ensuring that we provide language access, referrals for women who may be fleeing abuse. So we do form a lot of working collaborative partnerships with member programs of MNCASA, as well as Violence Free Minnesota. That's the main thing that we do. So as far as the importance of policymakers, or why it's critical to engage policymakers in this work, I really believe that elected officials play a vital role for survivors and victims of violence. Particularly, I wanted to touch on the survivors that we serve that are historically have been marginalized and or underserved. Our elected officials have some leadership bestowed on them, and I think they have a responsibility to protect survivors and victims through either passing off or repealing of some bills that may offer that healing and safety to disrupt the cycles of abuse for survivors and victims. I'm actually also, I have a public policy background, and I actually ended up going to School of Public Policy because I realized that there was a disconnect from the service providers to who are sitting at the tables in public policy spaces. And so I believe that it's really critical that we bring the voices of our community to our elected officials so that they can actually be seen and heard on behalf of community. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today to talk about these important subjects. I just want to briefly switch gears and talk just really briefly, or introduce really briefly a piece of, I'm not going to call it a piece of legislation because it's actually multiple pieces of legislation, but a package that the coalitions are all collaboratively working together to push at the Capitol this year. It's called an increasing, we're asking the legislature to increase the state investment in victim services. And there's a couple different pieces to this, and you'll hear about this from each of the panelists. So I'll just do a really quick overview, and then you'll hear about more detail from each of the panelists about all these different pieces. So we're asking for the legislature to make a $4 million annual investment in emergency funds and direct client assistance to support the needs of domestic and sexual violence victims and survivors, as well as the victims of other general crimes. In essence, current funding is woefully inadequate to address those basic needs of all crime victims. This would be administered by the Department of Public Safety through the Office of Justice Programs, and really would support some of the existing programs that they have that are just simply underfunded at this point. We are asking for a $10 million annual investment for community-based programming. This would include domestic abuse transformation programming, restorative and transformative justice initiatives. And this would also be administered through the Department of Public Safety and Office of Justice Programs. And it's my understanding there's some money in the governor's budget for this piece, we believe at this point. So that's some good news there. We are looking to continue sustaining and strengthening some of the prevention competitive grant programs that have been in existence for a while. And finally, we are supporting a $7.5 million annual increase to fund housing through the Emergency Services Program. A lot of you may know of that as ESP. That ESP funding provides emergency shelter and safety from both COVID-19 and violence through congregate, scattered site, and motel settings. Domestic and sexual violence is a leading cause of family homelessness. And we know that adults and children both experience very high rates of violence while homeless. So this investment in ESP funding and ongoing ESP funding, and I just want to make that point, all of these different pieces and these asks are for ongoing funding, not one-time funding. I think that's important to recognize, that we're really asking for an ongoing investment from the state. The investment in ESP funding will directly benefit victim survivors and helping them to gain safety and prevent further violence. So with that, I have some more questions for the panelists. Let's see, Artika, $7.5 million is being requested for housing for victim survivors. We know about the connections between domestic violence and housing. Can you tell us more about why housing is an issue that really relates to sexual violence as well, and connect those dots from an advocacy lens?
Sure, thanks, Lindsay. Well, there's a high correlation between people who have experienced sexual assault and those who are experiencing homelessness. People who have a lack of access to shelter are at higher risk for sexual violence than people that have stable housing. Although sexual violence is among the most underreported crimes, available statistics that we have reveal that 1 out of every 5 women, 1 in 6 men, and nearly half of all transgender people have experienced sexual assault in their lifetime. And for people without stable housing, it is even more alarming and more critical for them to have stable housing. There was a report, recent study from the Downtown Women's Center. They focused on the sexual assault rates among women and homeless women, and 42% reported that they have been sexually assaulted at some time or at some point in their lifetime, and 23% have experienced sexual assault within the last year. So we can learn from this data, and really from an advocacy point of view, I don't think that I'm telling anyone anything that they don't already know, but the data is clear, and there's a direct correlation between folks that are experiencing homelessness and sexual assault. So it's imperative that we're taking a look at that, and along with safe and supportive housing, we're providing the services that people need to heal. I really believe that safe, affordable housing is a basic human right, and we should be looking at it.
Thank you. I just realized that I was derelict in my duty to remind you all that the Q&A is there for questions. So if anybody has questions, you can put that in the Q&A, and we've got a few different folks sort of monitoring, and we'll be popping in, and we'll be answering questions at the end as well. So thank you so much, Artika. That's a helpful framework. Comfort, $4 million is being requested for direct client assistance and financial assistance for survivors in Minnesota. Why is that direct financial assistance for victim survivors important? Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, so when we think about domestic violence, we think about the physical abuse or emotional abuse, but sometimes I think what goes under talked about is the impacts financially on survivors and victims. So there's a survey that the Institute for Women's Policy Research, IWPR, did, and it revealed just how deeply domestic violence, sexual violence can affect survivors like education, career, economic stability over the course of their whole life. And some examples for numbers provided by the CDC in a recent study show that the cost of domestic violence over a victim's lifetime for a woman is on average a little over $103,000. And then for men, it's a little bit under $23,000. So some of these costs, they show up in terms of like medical costs. Survivors and victims end up having to incur costs long-term. Survivors and victims end up having to have some disrupted education. A lot of the women we work with, for example, at Phumulani, reported how their abusers' behaviors or patterns of behavior negatively impacted their ability to either successfully complete higher education or training, and or actually start any higher education or training, which is on its own a form of abuse. And this prevents them from attaining higher paying jobs. So direct financial assistance to support survivors and victims to pursue their career goals, for instance, through training and their higher education, is essential part of the healing process of and sustaining survivors. So we also have, for example, we have financial abuse or damage to credit for victims or survivors, things like that. So for us being able to advocate for the $4 million to provide direct services for survivors, is from member programs, it will equip us as programs to be best positioned to address some of the hurdles that impact survivors or a victim's ability to move on to safety in a more financially sustainable way. I wanted to just say some quotes that I thought of this morning as I reflected on our work as Phumulani. In our African immigrant community, it comes up a lot on why women stay. I hear this a lot. I'm staying for my children. You hear that. That translates to, I cannot afford to take care of the children, so I will stay so that the children can have, a roof over their head or have food. Because normally when women are in abusive situations, they are normally forced not to work and or, financially they are not in a place to take care of their children. Or I cannot move because I'm scared of how I can provide for my children. So our ability to make sure that survivors and victims are financially sustainable will be one of the things that will be resolved by this $4 million. And I think that is why it's crucial for us to have these funds for direct client services. Thank you.
Thank you for your work and for laying that out for us so clearly today. Linda, $10 million is being requested to develop community-based restorative justice and transformational justice programming in Minnesota. What ideally do you think that would look like?
Well, I'm not sure that everybody has ideas about those concepts, but I do know that community-based restorative justice and addressing violence against women, ideally, that would have meant that victims, offenders, and community members would meet to decide how to do this. And what works in one community might not be realistic for another community. But most of this work would emphasize on offender accountability, and it would be a way to respond to the conflict and the harm that has been done. And it works to make things right, or well, as right as possible for those who were affected. Restorative justice stems from kind of that same thought process, but it takes a little bit of a firmer stand. So I'm thinking that the whole movement has been solely held up by the criminal justice response, which has proved to be ineffective in many communities. So the funding would give communities in Minnesota the opportunity to envision what this might look like in their community. It would be developing a community-based restorative justice and transformational justice response to gender-based violence. And the people will get the opportunity to envision what a response to gender-based violence could look like and how it would look opposed to our over-reliance on the criminal justice system. For our tribal communities, it might include a cultural response that includes the traditions that are based on the tribal value systems and the teachings that are still alive today in each of our communities. Thank you for asking me that.
Thank you for sharing all that with us. I think I love the piece in your answer that is all about being really victim-centered and community specific. I think that's such an important thread through a lot of these conversations. Bobbi, in some communities, there's a wavering trust in law enforcement. We're switching gears a little bit. The state investment package clearly supports on both advocacy and support from victim services and does not highlight an increase in law enforcement support to help with or work with victim survivors. While there are still critical and essential connections between law enforcement and sexual violence, how do we hold all of this? How do we hold this mistrust by working within these systems that we're all pieces that are pieces of all of our work?
Right. This isn't a quick conversation. So in the time that I have, I'm going to really be only able to offer kind of some surface level. I want to just say MAC currently is really undertaking and immersing ourselves in experiences and conversations to deepen our understanding and our capacity to authentically engage in this work. And so I invite anyone who would like more information about what it is we are doing, our board, and bringing our membership into that to feel free to reach back to me. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to acknowledge that historically, the gender-based violence movement, the anti-violence based movement has invested almost all of our proverbial eggs into the criminal justice basket. And so we need to be accountable for that we have been a part of creating a system that now we hold a lot of mistrust with. So if we have been able to be at these tables and over time build relationships of trust and act in a trustworthy way, I think now our responsibility is to interrupt the white narrative, the feedback loop that maintains the status quo in our work with law enforcement, and take every opportunity to provide a counter narrative or a balancing narrative. So the reinforcing narratives that have kind of kept all of this going, and this is just, again, a few of them, are, the insistence on binary identities and their either or thinking, their productivity measures, and at the center of it, the patriarchy. So when we talk about balancing or counter narratives, some examples could be specifically naming the unexamined behavior that's at the root of how law enforcement exists and operates. Naming the need to prioritize the common good. Moving to both and thinking, normalizing complex identities, and creating a shared hope and vision for what should be. I believe that our work with law enforcement should center the voices of those that are most marginalized among us. And a really critical piece, I believe, is moving away from this concept and conversation around cultural competency, because I think that's a lie and a myth. What we need to move towards is intercultural dependency, where we can only do this work when we are connected to one another and need the voices of all to inform our work. That was it.
It was a big question. I know that most of these questions are big asks for 2 or 3 minutes, and I know we're trying to cover a lot of different topics, so there's a lot of these. But thank you for that, Bobbi. Katie, can you talk about how this funding package really took shape and what we can expect this year at the Capitol?
Yes. So we, the coalitions, came into the 2020 legislative session last year with a figure of $20 million, a $20 million need for additional funding for victim services. And this was before the COVID-19 pandemic. So certainly the needs of victim survivors and programs have been great before the pandemic. They continue to be great as this pandemic has exacerbated challenges survivors are facing. And we know that they'll continue to be great in a post-COVID world. Hopefully we'll get there. Currently, Victim Services receives $24 million about from the state general fund for crime victim services. So that includes domestic and sexual violence programs, general crime victim funding, and then child abuse funding, which also includes parenting time centers and child advocacy centers. Minnesota gets about $32 million in Victims of Crime Act or VOCA funds. And VOCA funds, that $32 million accounts for over 50% of the funding for programs in Minnesota. And VOCA funding is currently at risk. So the Crime Victim Fund is funded entirely from criminal fines from federal from federal convictions, not from taxpayer funds. And recently, the VOCA funds released annually have begun to decline because of shrinking deposits and declines into the Crime Victims Fund balance. So these declines are due to prosecutorial strategies that have changed over the course of the last decade. But when deposits into this fund are reduced, the amount allocated to states for victim services is then reduced. And that's a very, very big deal for Minnesota, since so much of our funding comes from VOCA funds. And if this funding is not sustained, victim service providers will lose critical funds and have to close or reduce services. So we really came in with this $20 million ask saying, hey, state of Minnesota, you need to continue to increase your investment in these services because our federal funding is no longer as secure as it once was. So that's where the ask for the additional $10 million for victim service providers and for programming for folks who are perpetrating violence really was rooted in. And then certainly, as Comfort alluded to, COVID has also exposed how critical direct client assistance funding is for survivors and their families, paying for things like first month's rent, for transportation, food for families. So that was how that got incorporated into this state investment funding ask as well. And then the last piece is the coalitions have been working hard to develop strong partnerships with other coalitions and movements, including folks in the housing and economic justice world. And so for the first time, our proactive agenda and funding asks, there's some that are sort of ours, the victim advocacy coalitions, and some that are being carried by our partners that we are including on our priority funding list because of the interconnectedness of violence and these other issues with which Artika touched on as well. We know that, again, these needs are great, that we need to invest in housing, we need to invest in victim services, we need to invest in prevention, specifically culturally specific programming in communities of color to prevent domestic and sexual violence. So really this package came together around concerns of funding on the federal level, the COVID-19 response and the needs for direct client assistance, a need to invest in prevention, and a need to invest in safe and affordable housing options for survivors. In terms of what to expect at the Capitol in the coming year, expect uncertainty. There is just a lot of unknowns. Legislators have been working remotely now due to the COVID-19 pandemic and have been very vocal about how they miss in-person lawmaking. So they're hoping to get back to that again if we can get to a post-COVID world. And there are lots of challenges with working remotely, but there are also some opportunities, especially for accessibility to testify. We've really seen COVID open up accessibility to hearings. And for folks who maybe traditionally haven't been able to make it to the Capitol can now participate in a way that they haven't before. We're also still the only state in the country with a divided legislature. So we have a Democratic governor and a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. So there's lots of partisan bickering that we're seeing and lots of concessions that are having to be made because of that. So again, we can expect the unknown, and that's the best I have.
That expecting the unknown sums it up pretty well for me. The one thing I was thinking about as you were talking, Katie, is how is the impact of the legislature meeting every single month throughout 2020, I think is also really sort of adding to that, in that everything's kind of behind. Nobody had the prep time. None of the supportive offices that usually prep for things ahead of time have had the space to do those things. I think that kind of has just added to this sort of unknown surprises that we've seen. We're going to shift gears just a little bit, and I'd just like to ask. We're gonna work through all the panelists again, and I have some questions about what do we need to do to stay engaged, to stay informed, and to hold our elected officials and policymakers accountable for our needs. So we'll shift gears a little bit, and then after that, we'll move on to field some additional questions from all of the audience, and I think we've got questions maybe coming in off of Facebook Live as well. But if you If you're watching and have questions, be sure to just put them in the Q&A and we will get to those. But first, Artika, I have a question for you. I'm wondering if you can talk about how we model discomfort while actively being involved in systems change. It's another small question.
Just a little small question. And I apologize. I think my audio is just a little light. And that's one of the things, that's one of the barriers with Zoom and technical things. So I will try to speak louder so people can hear me. You know, our systems are really rooted in practices that thrive on comfort to maintain the status quo of what the system does. And I once was talking to someone about a large county system, and they told me large systems are designed to eat innovation and change for breakfast, lunch, and dinner to maintain that status quo. And so those things that we do, that comfort level, you know, really is rooted in, you know, our system oppressive practices. Bobbi talked about this. We could call it white supremacy. But it is rooted in things like perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensive-ness, quantity over quality. There's only one way to do it, and fear of open conflict. And we know as advocates and people that have been doing this work for a long time that we can't do the work without some conflict arising, without some opposition to different positions. And we need to feel comfortable about that. And it's not our job to make our system partners feel comfortable about being at the table. And so what we need to do is really kind of distinguish between who is in here and why are they lifting that concern? And is it for centering victims and survivors? Is it for the best outcomes? Once we can use that lens, then we probably can navigate through some of those hard issues. But what I would request of you, and these are conversations that I'm also having with people, is like, don't leave folks hanging. If someone has the courage to speak up in a meeting to talk about how we can make changes in an effective way, calling them or emailing them and co-signing on their suggestion after the meeting is not the way to be an ally. It's not the way to be aligned. It's really disheartening. So as we talk about how do we work through those hard conversations and that discomfort, we also have to be reflective about how we're showing up in those conversations as well. Are we letting one person always be the person who's ringing the alarm and the alert with and sitting back and watching that happen? Or are we actively in there and engaged in supporting the work that we value and the things that are true? I would say the last thing is that discomfort is an opportunity. So instead of looking at discomfort as a problem, as a barrier, it's an opportunity for us to work through and get through the other side. So I would say, you know, lean back, settle in that discomfort, and support folks in the work of working through it.
Thank you. Linda, can you talk to us about the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force? Talking about one of those things that we can collaborate on and be allies around. There are a lot of tasks that are laid out in the report. How do we as a coalition, how do member organizations, how do we lift all those pieces up?
Well, I think I want to say thank you to Artika for saying what you said so eloquently. It's not, and it is, change is uncomfortable for most people, and changing, especially the way you think and the way you feel and challenging yourself. And probably we need to look inside of our own organizations and challenge ourselves. I mean, we're in the process of doing that constantly, because things are changing, and everything we've done so far has provided, we've tried to provide support and direct services to victims and the communities, but there was way more. So I know that in my questions, I was looking, and I just want to do an overview for people who don't know about the task force and when it was started. It was in 2019. Minnesota focused on the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and they released its first report, which was about American Indian women and girls. We make up about 8% of the murdered women and girls in the state. We do know also that Indigenous women and girls make up only about 1% of our entire state population, according to a report that was released by the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. The first published report had several findings, including we know, and it was discussed, and we had many contributions. A lot of us in the community already knew that the root cause of the MMIW injustices are based in colonization and historical trauma, racism and sexism, and sexual objectification of Indigenous women and girls. Here. Well, Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit are not at increased risk of violence because of their individual risky behaviors or poor choices, but rather they are at risk because of a systemic risk factor such as poverty, homelessness, child welfare involvement, domestic violence, sex trafficking, and prostitution, which place them in dangerous situations. Once an Indigenous girl or woman goes missing or dies under suspicious circumstances, the investigation, prosecution, and sentencing processes that are supposed to serve justice often fail to provide equal and fair treatment for Indigenous victims. The system does not include sufficient resources for adequate cultural response, healing resources for Indigenous victims or survivors, families, and communities. I know this has come up, as a focus. We in Minnesota have our own day of public awareness, which is February 14th. And the nations across the United States have May 5th as their day that they're doing things across the nation to raise awareness. Some of the other pieces to this would be, the hope was, that the intention is we're going to create an office, as we're talking about. The governor had put in his proposed budget about $500,000 per year for 2 years, where the DPS would house the office that would create kind of a dashboard of a response that would be able to have connection with tribal, state, and local agencies to start to have a place to gather that information and to have a response and to have a connectedness within all of our communities. And I'm thinking that the conversations that I've talked about how to be a genuine ally are the same for all of our communities. It's the Indigenous community also, but I have been going across the state and talking about building good relationships with tribal communities because there is a lot of misinformation in our public school system. Teaching people are leaving out or omitting true parts of American history. And as long as that keeps happening and we're not addressing that, people will still be floating in the same ideas and understandings. And it creates, I always say there's not a big push for some people to get them to hate. It's when somebody really is feeling, they have a lot of misinformation. So I'm thinking that, how we could do this is building relationships with our with our allies right in our communities, you know, whether it's attending each other's events, being involved in community, not just when I need you to do something, but I'm going to be with you. I'm going to come there, and everybody's got their own focus, but somehow these all cross into each other's work. And that's why we're here with each other today and to talk about this. But I appreciate the time to focus on this task force. And I know that Nicole has been asked to come to right next door to Wisconsin to discuss, you know, and to hear about what happened in Minnesota and how that focus. This is not just a Minnesota issue. This is a nationwide problem. And as long as we have that disconnect between jurisdictions, information, poor training, or not enough funding for law enforcement, and not enough understanding in the community, but the underlying lack of you know, accurate information on the history of our country and our indigenous people, there's going to continue to be that. I feel like this is the start, was to start a groundwork and an understanding and a place from which to grow and hopefully stop what's happening. It's like every month we're getting more information. Sometimes it's every week, you know, and so I appreciate the time to talk about it. And I am honored to be in a state that is taking this serious, and that we have enough support and allies and people who really sincerely care to listen and to be a part and take time to be with us and to talk about this and to help us to figure it out. Not one person holds all the answers. We all have pieces of this on how we got to where we're at. And I'm looking forward to the uncomfortable place of change, but the result, I'm hopeful for my my children and my grandchildren and our communities, that it will be better for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And thank you for framing up. It's such a, that first report is so big. Thank you for framing up some of the really critical pieces. I don't know if I can commit to this because I haven't actually asked anybody this, but I believe we can send out some of the materials that are being referenced today to attendees. People are nodding at me. I think that's true. So I won't promise that, but we'll try to sort of gather up. Lauren's nodding yes. Okay, we'll try to gather up some of the materials and reports and things that are being referenced today, so we can send those out to folks, and maybe post what we can on the Facebook Live page as well. Okay, I have another question here. This question is for Comfort. Let's see. I know you're next. I just can't read the question yet. Okay. Phumulani is new, and I think I'm pronouncing that right, but if I'm not, please correct me. Okay. How do you balance direct services with statewide advocacy? How is that working for your organization?
Okay, well, thank you. So I always say at this point, Phumulani is very small, but dynamite, you know, dynamite coming in small packages. So when I think about how we have managed or how we continue to balance direct work with statewide advocacy, I think of the African proverb that says, you know, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go furthest really, you go together. So with Phumulani, I think earlier on in our work, we realized the importance of actually creating working collaborative partnerships with other anti-violence member programs and coalitions. I think this has really enabled us as a smaller organization with very much limited capacity to be able to attend to statewide policy work or advocacy. Just this week, I'll give an example. I'm always a storyteller, so I like to give stories as examples. This week, we were having some situations with survivors from a specific part of town, and I actually called in an emergency meeting with the chief of police of that particular town, with a council member and the city manager, and just explained to them what is happening in my community. And they are in the middle of addressing that. So being able to just sometimes invite ourselves to the table, because I know our communities are often not invited to the table. We've mastered the art of, just being at the table, even if we're sitting at the corner, but we try to invite ourselves to those spaces where actually policies are being made and there's change. We've managed to also to balance the work by joining coalitions like other programs at the intersections of like not just domestic violence, sexual violence, but looking at like homelessness, right? So like ending homelessness coalitions, joining those platforms to be able to know what is going on and what impacts our survivors and victims. Phumulani also, we're currently participating in the security task force, the women's economic security task force. So those kind of spaces where, as I spoke about earlier, the importance of direct financial support, being on this kind of task force, for me, as a leader of Phumulani, means bringing the voices of the women we work with to this security task force, which then translates to policy at some point, and making sure that the voices of the survivors and victims are included in that. So that's kind of how we've done it. But I have to say that, yeah, sometimes it's challenging. It's challenging to juggle, both. But I think with the powerful working collaborative partnerships we continue to create statewide, it's been helpful. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. One of the things that I think I just heard as a thread through everything you just said is that connection between an individual survivor's story and experience and how that fits into sort of that larger whole, whether that's bringing that story and experience to a task force, or really sort of on a smaller community level, bringing that story and those voices to your local law enforcement. I mean, there's just such connections there. And I think I wonder if sometimes people, maybe this isn't true, but I wonder if sometimes people who aren't really engaged in this think about these as sort of one-off situations instead of really this sort of these really huge connections to systems that I'm hearing all of you talking about, seeing every single day. Mm-hmm. So speaking of systems, I have another easy question for Bobbi. Bobbi, many of us and much of our work is really entrenched in these systems that are engaged in active oppression of marginalized communities. What does accountability look like when we need to sustain these relationships in order to do pieces of our work, knowing that there's also harm being done?
Right. So the first part of my answer, I'm encouraged because I've heard a lot of what I'm going to say already said by other panelists. So I'm encouraged by that. I think it shows that we are having these conversations as a community of coalitions and programs. So I'm going to start by saying the work to dismantle and rebuild systems takes a lot of time and intentional effort. And I think we first have to ask ourselves, are we committed for the long haul? I think in the past we have gone for quick wins and not really been committed for the long haul. I know in my work, and I'll just speak for that, when I have sat at tables, a lot of the times it was about the person sitting at the table. People trusted me and I trusted the people at the table. And I think we have to make sure that our organizations and our movements are institutionalizing these core values in our organizations. What we want to see reflected back to us, we need to be. I think we also need to have empathy for individuals that are working within these systems who get it and want to make change. So there has to be room in there for some empathy for them. The other thing I want to say before I start talking about maybe some accountability measures is that we can't continue to do this work and this change work in siloed ways. I mean, just addressing the law enforcement system isn't going to bring about the type of community and culture that we need. We have to be doing this work in tandem with brothers and sisters in the movements, you know, the physical health care, mental health care, education, prosecutional scheme, statutory, all of those things. So I know that's kind of a duh, but I just really want to name that what I think part of what we're trying to dismantle and rebuild is the siloed way that systems work and that we work with systems. So as far as accountability, I think if we have been invested in building transformational relationships over time, the fruit of our work should become evident. And maybe these are accountability measures, or at least what begins to be articulated and evidenced in how the system is engaging differently in communities. So some of those would be, you know, moving to this belief in people and community, you know, in their intelligence and their power to create change. Recognizing and honoring the knowledge within people and communities, and really that they would stop telling people what they should know. Honor and believe in the self-interest of community. So don't tell people what they should do or what they should care about, but believe that communities know how to best manifest comprehensive safety within their community. I think this is a big one. This is something that, you know, some fruit that we would begin to see would be the facilitation and production of new knowledge, meaning truth telling, deep listening, and acknowledgement of the harm that has been caused. Relationship building for the purpose of developing community, right? Developing this new community. And then restorative processes, are they, as part of this new knowledge, are they willing to step into some restorative processes that would hold them accountable, and also work to repair some of the harm? I think ultimately it would be, do the actions, are we acting together? Are they acting with the community to benefit the community? For me, the ultimate goal in all of this is to build an anti-racist community and culture. That anti-racist systems, the public safety system, the legal system, the education system, all of those systems then would exist within. I mean, and that's a big, you know, but I think that those are some of the changes that I think we look for if we have really invested in building transformational relationships.
Thank you for that. So, Katie, how can we balance concrete information, tangible and attainable progress, with the discomfort of having to educate folks that we depend on to continue funding to do this actual work?
Mm-hmm. So it may be a little uncomfortable to educate lawmakers, but it is so important. And I want to share that direct constituent interactions have more influence on lawmakers' decisions than any other advocacy strategies. So influencing public decision-making is a critical and a legal means for nonprofit organizations to accomplish their missions. Open communication between policymakers and domestic and sexual violence programs as constituents contributes to well-informed policies and their effective implementation. So DV, SA, victim-serving programs are the experts on these issues, right? And survivors are the experts on these issues, and lawmakers need to be hearing from you. And lawmakers are accountable to you as their constituents. So that's really important to remember. So to the highest extent possible, we hope that programs are educating their legislators, educating their community, and really promoting the interests of survivors and their families. And Violence Free Minnesota and the other coalitions here are here to support you in doing that work. There's never a wrong time to be reaching out to your lawmakers. We would love for you to be sending emails, sending letters, making calls, scheduling virtual tours of your program, and adding, one-on-one meetings with your legislators. It's really all about relationship development. You want to know your legislators, and you want them to know who you are, what you do, and the ways that your work impacts their district and their community, and what survivors are experiencing. So the challenges, the successes, the funding needs. It's really critical that lawmakers are hearing from you on all of those topics. And there's really no better or more impactful way of communicating than a one-on-one, face-to-face, or now screen-to-screen. It's the most effective way of adding that really emotional element that's really needed when advocating for domestic violence and economic justice issues and other crime victim issues. It enables legislators to better understand where you're coming from and why. So those personal stories remind legislators that their policies impact real people who are simply trying to do their best for themselves and their children. So sharing personal stories and survivor experiences is an effective and informative way to make that connection with your elected official. And again, we really want you to look to the coalitions as a resource for information on what's happening at the state and federal level, for what type of advocacy is needed and when and where and to whom, and for support in developing those relationships with your legislators and advocating for funding and policies that benefit survivors and the programs that serve them. We're here to support you.
Thank you. Katie, do you mind if, well, I'm just going to add one detail because I get this call all the time and this question all the time, and I know you do too. It isn't lobbying to have educational conversations with your policymakers. You can do that without even having to think about the question of lobbying. If you are inviting them to your program, talking to them to educate them about domestic or sexual violence, those are all things that you can do without even having to think about any of the restrictions around lobbying. So I'll just add that little detail because I know that Katie and I both get that email fairly often. So we're now to the part where we are going to be looking at some questions. And I know we've got some questions in the Q&A. Feel free to put more questions in the Q&A. We've got folks keeping an eye on Facebook as well. So if you're watching there, and you can put your questions in the comment section there as well, and we will pull questions from that spot as well. And I'm going to pass this over to Lauren to field questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lindsay, and good job keeping time. We are so on time now. So I just wanted to share a couple of Facebook comments that came through. We just wanted to say a shout out to Comfort that you offer really great services, and these services can change the lives of these survivors. So there's recognition of your wonderful and new efforts. We had another Facebook comment directed towards Linda and her comments that we need to create transformational relationships, not transactional relationships. And that was a great point that you had made. And then we had another Facebook comment that said, the educational system needs a systematic reform. We're still using the original American curriculum, and it is the core root to the educational destruction. So some nice insight from Facebook. And then we have a question in the Q&A. Oh, we have two questions. This is very exciting. Okay, someone asked, how do you suggest interacting with legislators who are allies? Sometimes I assume they are on board with our policy priorities, but I know I shouldn't take it for granted. So does anyone want to address that?
I can jump in. I certainly think it is critical to stay in contact with legislators that are allies. It's a great thing if you have a good relationship with your legislator. Continue to share what your needs are. Continue to share what's going on in your community. Continue to share what the needs of survivors are, because they continue to change and they continue to be great. And I think that having that open line of communication is really important. Even if they may get our issues, right? We want them to do more than just get it and be supportive. We really want to push them to be champions on our issues. So certainly reach out regularly and often, keep those lines of communication open, even with allies, and stress how important the needs of victim survivors are in your community.
And I would just add and let them know that you're available for a resource. If they have questions, if they need some insight, just let them know that you're there and ready and available to support them with that information.
Thank you. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next question? Okay. The next question is, what would you recommend for a general community member to do to best engage with policy change efforts?
Okay, Comfort here. I'll speak from the space of our community members. So historically, most of the African immigrant community members, we have a very mistrusting relationship with our governments from where we come from. And so what we have been doing at Phumulani is actually to do like public policy, 101 with our community members, around the difference here in the States, how, you can actually, your public elected officials are approachable and they want to hear from you. And so that's how we've been doing the work. And I think to the general population as well, I would say engage with any of the grassroots efforts that are happening. Maybe connect with a program within your community, and then join the efforts to to be testifying. If there's opportunities to testify at legislation. But I would say engage with your local programs and see what policy issues that they're focusing on. That would be my advice. Yeah.
And this is also a community level election year. And so the policymakers will be out in different ways to connect with community. I know that a lot of those grassroots organizations, as Comfort talked about, will be doing Zoom events and virtual events. And that's a way to show up. And there's usually an opportunity to ask questions or get your concerns heard as well.
Any other thoughts from our other panelists about this?
Yeah, I would just echo what Comfort said. I think when you call legislators and say, I support X, Y, Z, that's helpful. I think it's more helpful if you can articulate the need. Why is this important? And so I think you're only going to know that by really getting involved with those grassroots organizations and communities so that you understand. It's not just, I think it's a good thing, so yes, I support, but that you would have some ability to a degree to articulate the need and the impact.
And we currently don't have any questions that are coming our way. So I just want to open up the space for any of the panelists. If you've had any reflections that you've developed during this talk that you'd want to share with our audience, now would be a good time. I'll just take this chance to thank everyone who's been on our panel. This is our first year at really trying to bring discomfort sort of out on a platter and say, here it is, and let's just kind of look at it all together right now. And we would just want to thank everyone in the audience for coming. And I also want to thank the panelists for each of you for your bravery for coming and being a part of this panel and helping us along with this discussion. Which will, oh, we have another question. Oh, this is very exciting, everybody. Okay, the question is, how can we support victim survivors in policy work? We'll talk about them being testimonials and speaking on behalf, but how does support look when someone is engaging in that sort of policy assistance or behavior?
I have thoughts. I think it's incumbent on us organizations who are asking them to testify, that we, I think like with anything, kind of give them this informed consent kind of, right? So it may feel good in this moment, but that we aren't, that we're tending to maybe, that unintended negative impact that might come from sharing their story. And so I think there's also this, we also need to really be aware of where this line is when we are providing opportunity and platform for them to share their voice and exploitation of their voice. So I just think there's a great deal of responsibility on us, our organizations and our community. We want to center their voices. We want their voices to be heard, but we need to do it in a way that also is safe and supportive for those individuals.
Thank you, Bobbi. And thank you, Comfort. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Artika. Just gonna kind of leave a couple of seconds of silence just in case anyone wants to pop up with another closing thought before our board chair, Kenosha, comes in and thanks us all for being here. Okay. All right, I think you can take it away, Kenosha.
All right. I just wanted to take just a moment to thank each of you for being a part of MNCASA's Action Week. I am really looking forward to working alongside MNCASA and each of you as we really dig into this new year. I think there are a lot of new opportunities for us as a movement. I think there are many adventures for us, and so I am up for a little bit of good trouble, and I hope that each of you are too. So again, thank you for joining us today. Continue to process the activities for this week. If you're not following MNCASA on Facebook, please do so. We have Instagram and also Twitter. So follow us and reshare that information. That is a collective action that can really make the activities from this week and future activities to go further. So thank you for that. And thank you for coming out today. All right, y'all have a great day.
Thank you.